Hi class, and welcome back to Social Psych. Today we're going to cover Chapter 13, Aggression. And as we do, you'll notice that we're going to talk about 6 different determinants of aggression, we'll kind of call them here. But first we're going to start off with what is aggression. And if you'd like to play along at home, I've got 10 examples of possible aggression here. And figure out which of these you think are aggressive. Go ahead and take a moment to pause. Turns out that all of these are aggressive except for 2. The only 2 that I would argue are not aggressive are a woman mentally rehearsing a murder and a Girl Scout who tries to assist an elderly woman across the street but accidentally trips her. Because when we define aggression here, we're talking about intentional behaviors aimed at causing physical harm or psychological pain. That's why even something like hurting an individual who's attacking you is still aggression, because you're trying to hurt them to stop what they're doing. Now, you'll notice that we can talk about this idea of a general aggression model. Please don't feel like this is something you need to memorize, but this is a good way to look at how much goes into whether or not we decide to act kind or aggressively. And so there's a ton of different factors, including situational, motivational, construal, how we see this perspective, social factors, cultural factors, and evolutionary factors that affect aggression. But within these factors, we can still break aggression down into 3 different types of aggression. There is, of course, hostile aggression, any kind of angry aggression that's aimed to hurt somebody mentally or physically, right? So if your friend says something mean to you and you shout something back in anger, that's hostile aggression. Instrumental aggression is going to be aggression caused to forward some goal other than causing harm or pain. So, if, for instance, you are a football player and you push the guy in front of you or you tackle somebody, you're not doing it because you hate them. You're doing it because it's part of your job, right? You're using aggression as an instrument, right, to show something here. Finally, we've got relational or social aggression, aggression that harms another through the manipulation of relationships. So spreading a rumor is going to be a type of aggression here. So with that in mind, let's talk about some situational determinants of aggression. And the first one is something that I think we all naturally know, especially those of us who have been in Florida most of our lives, but heat actually is an aggressive cue for us. High temperatures might lead to more aggression. Think about it, right? We have certain sayings, my blood is boiling, or somebody being a hothead. That's related to heat and anger. We know that there's some research that shows that cars that don't have any AC are more likely to honk. And that for Major League Baseball pitchers, they hit more batters on hot days, but there's no differences in walks and strikes. And a baseball pitcher knows how to throw a baseball, right? And so why is it that they're going to hit another player more on hot days? Probably because the aggression and the heat is getting to them. We're more likely to be hostile to a stranger in a 90-degree room. What a fun experiment to run, but a horrible experiment to be in. Imagine that you are going to be asked to take part in an experiment, but the heater is broken and you have to sit in a 90-degree room. You're going to be pretty mad pretty quickly. You can see some interesting other information that violent crime reaches a maximum during the summer months as the temperature goes higher. Heat waves are associated with violent but not nonviolent crimes here. Right, and here again is the chance of a pitcher hitting you with a baseball. Why does heat increase aggression? Well, because heat is going to be a physiological arouser. That's going to cause our fight and flight response to go. And it's not going to be flight because you can't flee the heat. It's all around you. We often misattribute that arousal, that like, oh, I'm sweating, to like, maybe I'm pissed and so I'm going to be mad. We have these strong mental associations between anger and heat. And, well, heat specifically is a noxious kind of stimuli. We don't like it. It causes pain, especially humid, right? Especially if you think about other things that are related to it. If you are in a hot summer crowd that smells terrible, you're going to get really angry faster. Now, of course, we know that like taking an ice bath is a way to reduce this as well. From there, We know that alcohol increases aggression, right? If you've ever been around somebody, you've probably seen it. This link is well documented, even if not provoked. Why? It reduces inhibitions. It makes it more likely to say or do the thing that you probably wouldn't have done sober. It disrupts the way you process information. Maybe you all of a sudden start perceiving somebody as being rude towards you when they weren't. We have this effect called alcohol myopia, or lacking of a self-awareness, this idea that alcohol makes you a little blind to some of the things that you're doing. There's also this idea of a think-drink effect. If you perceive that alcohol is going to affect you, it's more likely that alcohol will affect you. There have been studies that have shown this with placebos, giving people like 0.05% beer, right? I think it's like O'Doul's, and people will get drunk after a while, but they haven't really had any blood alcohol, right? They don't have any high blood alcohol. Alcohol and relationship conflict, we do know that, right, if you put people in three different conditions, we give them some alcohol, we give them what they think is alcohol, or we give them a control, some water, and then we let them drink, and we ask them how they feel about a current conflict in their relationship, and then ask them how they feel and their partner feels about it. It turns out when you're intoxicated, your emotions are a little bit more extreme, and especially about your partner. So, right, this is kind of arguing that alcohol is not always good when it comes to anger. A great way to get angry or make people angry at you is to provoke them, right? So if you provoke somebody to act aggressively, we tend to be likely to reciprocate. There's some important factors, though. Intentionality. Did they mean it? Were there mitigating circumstances? Like if you imagine if you bump into somebody in a bar, right, is that really a provocation? Chances are it's a busy bar and they didn't mean it, and they say sorry. But if you're walking down the street and somebody shoulder checks you for no reason and then just stares at you, you're probably going to get angry. And one study looking at this asked people to do a game with a reaction time game, and then you were able to shock the loser at different levels of shock. And so we basically had a computer play against the participant, but they thought it was another participant. And these other players that were really just a computer had different kind of strategies, we'll call them. The first kind just shocked the participant at the highest shock level the whole time. The second one did a low shock across the levels. The third one started low and then started to go up. And the fourth one started high shock and then eventually ended at low shock. The graphs you're seeing here are the amount of shock that the person put back to one of these four computers, basically. And you'll notice, when you get a high attack at the beginning, you're going to shock back in kind, because why are you provoking me? If you give me a low shock at the beginning, I'm going to give you low shocks back. Notice, if you start out high and then go down, that's kind of like, oh, I'm sorry about that. I don't mean to, right? So you're not going to feel as bad. But when they start low and go high, you take that as a provocation. You say, oh, we're going to play this game. Then watch how high of a shock I'm going to give you here. Okay, on to the big one here. Media violence and aggression. Oy, 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 right? This is a big one in the world, but there's some interesting things to note. The question of this is, do you think that violent TV, music, video games, do we think they really make people aggressive? Well, yeah, they do. But no more than having poor relationships with your mom and dad. No more than being born a male. No more than being in a prior physical instance of violence. Less than being in a gang. Watching TV, right? Violent TV, playing violent video games, are those the same things? We can also ask that. And well, it could be video games, right? Could be video games that are causing people to violence, but it could also be the peer groups that those kids have, right? It's not just that you're playing violent video games. Maybe the kids you're playing with are also violent. Maybe your family is violent, so you like violent video games. It could also just be aggressive behavior, and one way to get that aggression out is by playing video games. It could also be consumption of other violent media. Could be all of these things. My biggest factor, though, is what kind of video game, right? If I'm playing Grand Theft Auto versus Tetris, one of those is going to cause me a very different phenomenon. The reason I'm talking about this so much is not because it's just a personal issue that I care about. The reason I talk about this is because one of the biggest video game researchers is another professor in the department at Stetson. And what he's found is that certainly for maybe 5 or 10 minutes after you play an aggressive video game, you're going to feel a little bit more aggressive. Wouldn't you also feel a little bit more aggressive if somebody said something aggressive to you, though? And notice how that's different if you play something like Tetris, right? Tetris versus Grand Theft Auto might leave to different feelings. So when it comes to violent media can do a lot of things. It can make it more likely you imitate those. It can make you feel like this is normalized. It can increase perceptions that the world is violent. You can make you think that the way that you're feeling right now is due to anger. It can desensitize you. It decreases empathy. It can increase endorsement of violence to solve problems. You do all of these things. But why can it do all of these things? Well, because violence, when we watch somebody do something violent, that starts our fight or flight response. And so what do we tend to do? We tend to imitate people. So we're going to imitate the violent characters here. And that these primes, existing aggressive expectations, kind of promote these. So the best way I like to think about it is that it doesn't matter where it's from, right? Like playing a violent video game is certainly something, but also if you are watching people beat each other up, whether that violent TV, video games, even just being around guns, it turns out, is related to aggressive thoughts. Those are priming you with aggressive thoughts. And so when you're thinking aggressively, you're more likely to engage aggressively for violent behavior here. So that leads us into our second focus on aggression. That's motivation here. That sometimes we're motivated to be aggressive, right? So one theory on this is the frustration aggression theory. The idea that frustration is really useful because when something goes bad, right, I can get angry. I can Hulk out to get what I want eventually if I need to. A really cool study looking at this put a wire screen in front of children's toys and in a play area. It said basically, hey, look at all those toys over there. You can't play with them yet. Other kids got to play with them right away. Kids play nice when they're given a chance to play with those toys right away. However, when they're not allowed to play with them at first and then they get the chance, turns out those kids have that frustration built up. And so they get it out by playing with that aggression or playing with those blocks aggressively. So it turns out that one way that we can use aggression positively is to unblock a goal. But sometimes that might not always be the best here. Another factor on this is what we call scapegoat theory, right? The idea that when we don't necessarily know what is frustrating us, we're going to redirect at an easy target. So if I'm really mad, and this is kind of Freudian if you think about it, like if I'm really mad because my boss yelled at me, I might go home and take it out on my wife or kid. Very bad idea, because I think that that's a way that I can get that aggression out and say, you must be the cause of my problems here. Next, let's talk about the construal processes in aggression here. So one of the biggest construals of aggression is anger. Anger increases perceptions of unfairness and beliefs that others are going to be combative towards you. Anger is a motivator. It is useful to get people angry because they will do something. It is why outrage is sold on the internet, right? What is interesting, though, is that there are certain cues that can be associated with aggression here, one of which is guns. So what we did is very similar to that study when we talked about provocation. We make some students happy, some students angry, whatever, and we give them the chance to shock their partner who's just a computer. However, we leave a gun in the room. I don't know how they did this, that was okay, but there was like a shotgun and a pistol somewhere in the room that these people could see. Other people had a badminton racket in the room. And we looked at how much and how long we're going to shock these people. And it turns out that when you feel anger and there's guns in the room, you're going to shock people more than anything else, especially compared to no anger. So this is arguing that guns are aggressive cues. Guns make us think of aggression, and we go, okay, so I should be in an aggressive mindset. I should act mean if what around me is telling me to be mean. This doesn't work for one group of people, though. Hunters. Hunters don't shock people more if guns are in the room, because hunters construe weapons as tools, not as a violent object. Right? How they process it, how they perceive it mentally. So this is going to argue that, right, if you put a sword, a knife, a gun, anything like that in a room, people mentally are going to say, oh, okay, so I should be thinking angry. That's related to this. Related to this idea of construal is the construal of dehumanizing people. And I know we've discussed this in a previous chapter, but really talking about this idea that if you are to construe your enemy or this other person as not a human, you don't give them those human emotions, those human language ideas, their ability to communicate, this intelligence, it's much easier to treat this other person like an animal. And that makes it much easier to hurt that person. And so the two characteristics we can use to dehumanize are to deny these uniquely human traits. We can animalize you, make you like an animal, calling people dogs, things like this. The other way, though, is interesting. You can deny people their own human nature, the fact that they don't have maybe emotions, right? So they're not very human, but they exist. And this mechanizes people. It turns them into the idea of robots. They're automatons, right? They don't do anything. They don't have feelings. They just do. Now, right, dehumanization does facilitate intergroup violence because it's much easier to act violent towards a non-human than a human. And with that comes this idea of how we can self-regulate. So what happens when we're feeling negative, right, about something? Well, we can decide how we want to act, right? Do we want to hurt people or do we want to help people? So sometimes we might selectively choose to kind of look the other way, disengage that internal control, hide the fact that we're not going to do this, right? So this would be a way that we can allow ourselves to engage in unfair, inhuman behaviors, but still say that we're a good person, right? So the idea here is that we can redefine the behavior. Oh, I didn't just beat up that guy, I taught him a lesson. Right? I could disregard or distort the consequences. Oh, it didn't hurt them that bad. They'll get over it. Dehumanize or blame the victims, right? It's not my fault, or maybe they should just figure it out themselves. And finally, displace or diffuse responsibility. Say, well, actually, it's their fault, or, maybe it's, somebody else should have done something. It's not just my fault here. And so that is, right, a really kind of interesting way that your thoughts, your construal of the situation can affect if you're going to act aggressively or not. Moving on from there, let's talk about the socialization argument of aggression here. The idea that aggression does come from mom and dad, how they teach us, right? We are socialized to learn what other people do. We model those behaviors. We learn observationally, right? When we see our brother or sister get their mouth wiped out with soap because they swore, we know that we shouldn't swear. We can vicariously learn through watching the consequences of others' actions, right? If we see somebody, go ask to go to the bathroom and they get screamed at, again, I'm not going to do that. The sources of learning are our family, our friends, our society. How does this work? It's just watching. Right? And so what I have here is Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. I highly suggest you watch this. It's not very long, but the idea here is we have this model, a woman, simply just kind of gently beat up Bobo, who is like a Weeble Wobble doll, kind of like a punching bag doll. And what you find is that children very quickly are going to act aggressively if they see somebody else acting aggressively. If they watch a person, an adult, beat up on Bobo, they're going to beat up on Bobo. If they just see Bobo sitting in a room, yeah, they might push him over, but they're not going to do things like grab a hammer or threaten Bobo's life. Something very interesting here. Another type of authority we can think of comes from religion, right? And this is a fascinating study where we had people read some ancient passages we told people that this passage was either from the Bible or was from some ancient scroll, right? So giving it the same age. In the passage, God said it was okay to do some violent thing to somebody, or God said it wasn't okay to do some violent thing. So this is either, your God. We did this at some very Christian universities, BYU, Brigham Young University, versus, some just kind of ancient belief. After you did this, after you read this passage, you were then asked to play this noise blast game. So like the other ones, you can, anytime that you win, you can send a noise blast to the other person. Right, so you're working against this other person, and whoever was slower is going to have this noise blasted in their ears, and you control the volume. Well, what is fascinating here is that if you believe in God and you read a passage from the Bible that said, it's okay, God says it's okay to beat somebody up, you're going to be loud and you're going to be aggressive here. If you believe in God and there was no mention of violence here, right? Or this case where, this is an ancient scroll, this idea here, you're not going to act more violent. What this is suggesting is that the more respected this authority figure is, mom and dad, the government, religion, whatever, the more likely it is to influence you as a role model, right? If you really love your mom and dad and you're thinking like, oh, I don't want to upset them because they don't do that, that's what we're talking about here. So socialization plays a big role. Another idea, kind of not just local socialization, but cultural socialization, is the idea that where you grew up very much affects how anger is played out around you. So again, I did my doctorate in Texas at Texas A&M, and Texas is what we consider a culture of honor. So a culture of honor is going to be a culture that if you make fun of somebody, if you tarnish somebody's honor, their reputation, you've done a grave misdeed. This is a problem. These people tend to be more sensitive towards insults and use violence to stop that. Tends to be Southerners more than Northerners. Florida's a bit of a weird place because it's kind of a melting pot, but Texas really, it's its own thing. So the idea here is that any of us could be aggressive, right? But if our culture tells us that it's okay to show aggression, then we're going to show it. When we ask people from the South versus the North, how much, right, is it okay to be violent if somebody attacks yourself? People in the South are more likely to agree with this. Somebody attacks if somebody makes fun of you, if somebody makes fun of your family, or if somebody makes fun of your house, how likely you are to actually, you're willing to go to bat for this, to fight somebody for this. And you can think about this, right? Like Texas's slogan is "Don't mess with Texas." Beyond this, we see that there are more argument-related murders in the South and Southwest than there are non-argument-related murders in the other sides of this. And when we only look at white male homicide, white males causing homicides, where you see the most likely chance of a white male committing a homicide is in the South and the Southwest. And those numbers are rather high, which is, I find it interesting here. So a couple studies to show this. This first study is pretty much something I've already kind of given you the idea about. Imagine that you are walking in a hall and somebody bumps into you and calls you an asshole. So we've got somebody who's in on the experiment walking down, shoulder checks you a little and goes, "Watch out, asshole," and keeps going. You go to your room and do what your thing, and then we ask you, how do you feel right now? Are you angry or amused? 80% of Southerners reported feeling anger. 60% of Northerners reported feeling amused. They thought it was funny that somebody called them an asshole, versus Southerners were mad somebody called them an asshole. So, right, this is saying that people's honor is being threatened by calling somebody out. And this really goes to show in another study. So in this letter study, we are sending letters to different companies that are hiring. And in these letters, our supposed applicant has committed a felony. They were either in jail for 10 years, let's say for murder, or for motor vehicle theft. And so on the job application, you are supposed to say, have you ever been in jail? Can you explain why? On the murder applications, we wrote that I got into a fight with someone who was having an affair with my fiance. When I found out, they laughed in my face and asked me to step outside if I was man enough. Versus the theft condition. I have no excuse. I had a wife and kids, and by stealing, I was able to give them what I needed. I was desperate. It kind of also sounds like an excuse if you ask me, but well, we send these off. Southerners are more sympathetic than Northerners or to the murder condition, but there was no difference in the theft conditions. People in the South said, yeah, it looks like your honor was threatened, so you threw down, and that's a fair thing. Why is there a culture of honor here? Well, one argument comes from the kind of history, is that you being a cowboy out in the West, or right in Texas in this case, your reputation mattered a lot. If somebody stole from you, you had to go and show them that you meant business. So the idea is that by having honor, you are going to hold status in the community. From there, the last one we want to talk about is evolution and aggression. And so when we talk about this evolutionary argument of aggression, we got to recognize that it's useful to be aggressive, right? Physical aggression, especially in men, allows men to, hulk out, defend the group, secure high status, and theoretically get the best mate, and protect their mate and ensure that nobody steals their mate, right? This is very evolution based. I'm not saying that that's how this works anymore. But, right, you think about this in relation to, right, a couple, a man and a woman, right, in your typical thinking here. It would make sense for the man to be the more aggressive one if the woman is carrying a baby, because we don't want her going around getting into fights and getting hurt. There is a relationship with testosterone and aggression, but it is small. If you pump a person full of testosterone, it doesn't make them go completely Hulk. It just slightly increases their aggression. Right? It's not a major thing. And there's some research to show that it's not all innate. This isn't all totally evolved. If we raise a cat in isolation and then we show it a rat, over half of them won't even attack the rat, right? They haven't learned that from mom in this case. So it's kind of interesting to say that, right, aggression is, of course, going to be useful, but, right, not always. There's also the argument that, similarly, that a step-parent is more likely to be violent to a stepchild than their own child, from an evolutionary perspective of it being that we should devote more resources towards our own offspring. Not that I think that's a good thing, but it helps to explain some things. Now, of course, there are gender differences in evolution and aggression, right? Because as we mentioned, men are more likely to use hostile aggression, but women are more likely to use relational aggression here. One particular thing I like to bring up is for men, there's often what we call the precarious manhood hypothesis. The idea is that for men, being a man, quote unquote, is something that can very quickly be taken away just by, calling them a couple choice words. And so if a man is told, hey, you're not a man, or that's threatened, men are typically socialized to get aggressive, to show that precarious, or to show that manhood again. And so what we see is that men are more likely to engage in risky behaviors after their gender is threatened, right? If you call a man, right, like, what are you, a girl? They're more likely to go and do something aggressive afterwards. Not only that, this goes into the perceived societal expectations of young individuals, right? This idea that, right, over 35% of young men believe they should use violence to gain respect. And if that's kind of a socialized argument, that's problematic here. So we are able to reduce aggression, and that's an important thing to think about. The funny thing is that we're going to talk about stuff that my daughter has learned in 3rd grade. But to start off, we can think about this idea of punishment, right? Should I be smacking my daughter every time that she does something wrong? No, because what does my daughter learn? That's how you hurt people, right? That's how people do these things. What really is useful is what we consider the threat of mild punishment. So there's this cool study where we talk about a forbidden toy. So the idea is that, and this is the one that we discussed back in talking about cognitive dissonance, where, right, if we give a mild punishment, just enough to make the child justify that they shouldn't do this, they're going to realize that they shouldn't do that. Now, if you give a enormous harsh punishment, right? You say that, if you yell at your sister again, I will throw you into your bedroom for another 4 hours. Chances are that probably doesn't model the appropriate behavior. So typically you want to use small and mild punishments towards children. Now, one thing that was brought up with Bobo is, can we use catharsis? Can we just go to a rage room and beat it out of our system? Does acting aggressive cause further reduced aggression later on? No, right? The idea of this is not necessarily true. Just watching violent video games doesn't make people feel less aggressive. Just watching violent sports doesn't make people feel less aggressive. So, right? It doesn't work that way. If you do go home and punch your pillow to get your anger out, you're actually teaching yourself that violence is the answer. That when I get happy is when I punch my pillow, and so I should punch my pillow more. So the ways that we can reduce harm: get out of the heat. Turn on the air conditioner. Go inside if you can. It's Florida. Do as best you can. Consume food and drinks that engage in behaviors that have cooling effects. Do something to cool down. Use simple devices like counting to 10 even. Taking deep breaths to help cool you down, calm you down. Engage in something distracting. The other way to do that is use communication. Simply having people meet face-to-face tends to reduce conflict. Now, right, part of that is because you're gaining insight, and part of that is also as long as the anger isn't violent and demeaning here, right? If these two people are at each other's throats, that's going to be a problem. The last thing I like to talk about is reconciliation to reduce aggression. So if you've harmed somebody, right, and they're mad at you, how can you go about... This sounds like I'm manipulating them. How can you go about getting into their good graces? Well, you have to take full responsibility. I'm sorry for everything I did. I didn't mean to, right? The sincere apology. It wasn't what I meant to do here. I don't ever want this to happen again, and I promise we'll work so that doesn't do that. And then what can I do to make it up to you, right? And you can see how that kind of works to reduce harm and gain a reconciliation rather than just a kind of back and forth fighting forever. That covers everything I had to for aggression, which leaves us with one lecture left. Though if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Hope you're all doing well and have a great day. Bye-bye.